60 million Americans were watching television on October 28, 1956, waiting for Elvis Presley to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show, when something unprecedented happened. Instead of music, instead of dancing, instead of the hip-shaking controversy everyone expected, the cameras cut to a medical office where Elvis Presley was rolling up his sleeve for the polio vaccine, the same vaccine that millions of American parents were refusing for their own children. The March of Dimes had been begging celebrities for months to help change public opinion about the Salk vaccine, but everyone said no. Too risky, too controversial, too much career danger. But Elvis had a reason that nobody knew about, a childhood memory so painful that he'd never spoken of it publicly, a memory that made saying no impossible. When that needle entered Elvis's arm, parents watching across America didn't know they were witnessing the moment that would finally end their children's terror of summer, the season when polio struck hardest and iron lungs filled faster than hospitals could provide them. But to understand why Elvis would risk his career for a single shot, you need to know about the letter that arrived at Graceland 1 week earlier, a letter that would force Elvis to choose between his future and the ghost of a 7-year-old boy he couldn't save. It was October 21, 1956, and Elvis was at the peak of his career. His single Love Me Tender was climbing the charts, his first movie was about to premiere, the Ed Sullivan Show had finally agreed to book him after months of controversy about whether he was too dangerous for American television. Everything Elvis had worked for was finally coming together. That morning, his secretary brought him a stack of fan mail, the usual requests for autographs and photos. But one envelope stood out. It was addressed in careful, shaky handwriting, and the return address said simply March of Dimes, Memphis Chapter. Elvis opened it, and what he read made his hands start to tremble. Dear Mr. Presley, the letter began. My name is Margaret Anderson. I don't know if you remember me, but I was your neighbor on Alabama Street in 1950. You used to play with my son Tommy. He loved listening to you sing on our front porch. Elvis remembered. Of course he remembered. How could he forget? Tommy Anderson had been 7 years old in the summer of 1950. A bright, energetic boy who followed 15-year-old Elvis around like a shadow. Tommy would sit on the porch steps while Elvis practiced his guitar, singing along in his small, off-key voice, dreaming about being a singer just like his teenage hero. And then July came. The month when polio struck Memphis harder than any summer in memory. Margaret's letter continued. I'm writing to you because I now volunteer with the March of Dimes. We have a vaccine, Mr. Presley. Dr. Salk created a vaccine that could have saved Tommy. But parents are afraid. They won't let their children take it. We've tried everything, every kind of education campaign, every celebrity we could reach. Everyone says no. I understand why. It's risky for careers, for reputations. But Mr. Presley, children are still dying. 15,000 were paralyzed just this summer. 3,000 died. Most of them were Tommy's age. Elvis closed his eyes, and he was 15 years old again, sitting in the Andersons' living room, the sound of the iron lung filling the silence like mechanical breathing that never stopped. The letter's final paragraph was simple. You have the Ed Sullivan Show coming up. 60 million people will be watching. If you would consider taking the vaccine on television, showing America that it's safe, we could save thousands of children. I know it's asking too much. I know what you'd be risking, but I also know that Tommy loved you, and that you sang to him every day in that hospital room until, I just thought I should ask. Elvis set the letter down with shaking hands. His mother Gladys, who had been watching from the doorway, came into the room. What's wrong, baby? She asked. Elvis couldn't speak. The memories were flooding back, memories he'd spent 6 years trying to forget. It had started with Tommy complaining about a headache on a hot July afternoon in 1950. By evening he had a fever. By the next morning, he couldn't move his legs. Within 3 days, Tommy Anderson was in an iron lung at Memphis General Hospital, his small body encased in the metal cylinder that breathed for him when his own lungs began to fail. Elvis had gone to the hospital every single day. He would sit beside the iron lung and sing to Tommy through the mirror that allowed the boy to see the world outside his metal prison. Gospel songs, mostly. How Great Thou Art was Tommy's favorite. Elvis would sing it over and over, watching Tommy's lips move in the mirror, trying to sing along even though he could barely whisper. "Promise me something," Tommy had said on the 7th day, his voice so quiet that Elvis had to lean close to the mirror to hear. "Promise me you'll never let this happen to another kid. You're gonna be famous, Elvis. I know you are. You're gonna be the biggest singer in the world. And when you are, you gotta promise you'll help kids like me." Elvis had promised. What else could a 15-year-old boy do when his friend was dying? Tommy died 2 days later. The iron lung kept breathing, but Tommy's heart had given out. He was 7 years old. Elvis had carried that promise for 6 years. Through every performance, every moment of rising fame, the memory of Tommy's request haunted him. But what could he do? He was just a singer. He had no medical training, no scientific knowledge. How could he possibly help children with polio? And now, holding Margaret Anderson's letter, Elvis finally had an answer. But it terrified him. Gladys read the letter over Elvis's shoulder. "Oh baby," she whispered. "That poor woman, that poor little boy. She wants me to take the polio vaccine on television." Elvis said, his voice hollow, on the Ed Sullivan Show, in front of 60 million people. Gladys was quiet for a long moment. "What are you gonna do?" "I don't know, Mama. Everyone's saying no to this. Every celebrity they've asked. And they're right to say no. If something goes wrong, if I have a bad reaction, my career could be over. Everything we've worked for." But even as he said it, Elvis knew the truth. Tommy Anderson had asked him to help children with polio, and now he had the chance. How could he say no? The next day, Elvis called the March of Dimes office in Memphis. A woman answered, her voice professional but tired. "March of Dimes, how may I help you?" "This is Elvis Presley," he said. "I received a letter from Margaret Anderson." There was a long silence. Then, "Mr. Presley, is this really you?" "Yes, ma'am, about the vaccine campaign. I want to help." Another silence. "Mr. Presley, did Mrs. Anderson explain what we're asking?" "It would mean taking the vaccine on live television during your Ed Sullivan appearance. The risk to your career." "I understand the risks," Elvis interrupted. "How do we make this happen?" What Elvis didn't know was that his decision was about to trigger a cascade of events that would change everything. The March of Dimes immediately contacted the Ed Sullivan Show production team. Ed Sullivan himself was initially resistant. "This is supposed to be an entertainment show," Sullivan told his producers, "not a medical demonstration. Besides, what if Presley has a bad reaction? We'd be liable. We'd be finished." But Elvis insisted. More importantly, Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, saw an opportunity. "Think about it," Parker told Sullivan. "Elvis Presley showing America that he trusts this vaccine. It's not just entertainment, it's history, it's courage. And yes, it's risky. But if it works, if parents start vaccinating their children because Elvis showed them it's safe, you'll be the show that saved thousands of lives." Sullivan gave in. But he had conditions. The vaccination would happen before the show, with cameras present but not broadcasting live. If Elvis had any kind of negative reaction, they would destroy the footage and never mention it. Elvis would appear on the show as planned, performing his songs, and only at the very end would they show the vaccination footage. "It's the best I can offer," Sullivan told Elvis. "It protects you and it protects the show." Elvis agreed. But he had one request of his own. He wanted Margaret Anderson there. He wanted Tommy's mother to see him keep the promise he'd made to her son. October 28, 1956 arrived. Elvis was scheduled to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show at 8. At 6 p.m. he arrived at the medical office inside the CBS building where the vaccination would take place. Camera crews were already set up. Ed Sullivan was there, looking nervous. And in the corner, sitting quietly with tears already in her eyes, was Margaret Anderson. Elvis walked over to her first, before acknowledging anyone else in the room. "Mrs. Anderson," he said quietly, "I should have done this 6 years ago." Margaret stood and embraced him. "You were just a child yourself," she whispered. Tommy wouldn't blame you. He'd be so proud of what you're about to do. The doctor who would administer the vaccine was Dr. Harold Morrison, a respected pediatrician and one of the early advocates for the Salk vaccine. He approached Elvis with a warm but serious expression. "Mr. Presley, I need to make sure you understand what we're doing here," Dr. Morrison said. "The Salk vaccine has been proven safe in extensive trials. Over 1 million children have received it without serious complications. But there's always risk with any medical procedure. Side effects could include soreness at the injection site, mild fever, or in extremely rare cases, allergic reactions. If you experience anything unusual, I understand, doctor." Elvis interrupted. "Let's just do this before I lose my nerve." What Elvis didn't say out loud was that his hands were already shaking. Not from fear of the needle, but from the memory of Tommy. Every time he looked at Dr. Morrison's medical bag, he saw the iron lung. Every time he heard the doctor's voice, he heard the mechanical breathing. His teenage trauma was flooding back with overwhelming force. Elvis sat in the chair set up for the cameras. The bright lights made him squint. He'd performed for thousands of people, but somehow this felt more terrifying than any concert. This wasn't about entertainment. This was about showing 60 million Americans that he trusted this vaccine enough to put it in his own body. "Are you ready, Mr. Presley?" Dr. Morrison asked. Elvis looked over at Margaret Anderson. She was watching him with an expression of hope and grief combined. A mother who had lost her son but might now help save other children. Elvis thought about Tommy's promise. He thought about the 15,000 children paralyzed that summer. He thought about all the children who might never have to see an iron lung if enough parents could just overcome their fear. "I'm ready," Elvis said. Dr. Morrison prepared the injection. The cameras started rolling, and what those cameras captured was something remarkable, something that would indeed change American history. They captured Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, the teenage heartthrob who made girls scream and parents worry, rolling up his sleeve with hands that visibly trembled. They captured him looking directly at the camera and saying, "I know a lot of you folks are scared about this vaccine. My mama was scared too, but I trust Dr. Morrison here, and I trust the science. More importantly, I knew a little boy named Tommy Anderson, who didn't get the chance to have this vaccine. I promised him I'd help make sure other kids don't have to go through what he went through." The needle went into Elvis's arm. Elvis didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the camera, kept his expression calm even though inside he was fighting every instinct to run from that medical office and never look back. "That wasn't so bad," Elvis said when it was done. "Little pinch, and if this means even one child doesn't end up in an iron lung this summer, then it was worth it." Dr. Morrison put a small bandage on Elvis's arm. "You'll need to wait here for 15 minutes, he said. "Standard observation period to make sure there's no immediate reaction." Those 15 minutes felt like 15 hours to Elvis. He sat in that chair, cameras still rolling, making small talk with Ed Sullivan while his mind raced with anxiety. What if he did have a reaction? What if this whole thing backfired? What if parents saw him on television, and instead of being reassured, they became even more afraid? But nothing happened. No reaction, no side effects, just a slight soreness in his arm where the needle had been. "Looks like you're all clear, Mr. Presley," Dr. Morrison said with a smile. "That's exactly what we tell parents. The vaccine is safe. The vast majority of people have no reaction at all." Margaret Anderson approached Elvis as he stood up from the chair. She took both of his hands in hers. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was breaking. "Thank you for keeping your promise to Tommy. Thank you for being brave enough to do what so many others wouldn't." Elvis's own eyes were wet. "I just hope it helps, Mrs. Anderson. I hope it makes a difference." 2 hours later, Elvis was on stage for the Ed Sullivan Show, performing "Don't Be Cruel" and "Love Me Tender" for 60 million Americans. The audience screamed. The cameras famously showed him only from the waist up. Controversy about his hip movements still raging. It was typical Elvis magic, the kind of performance that made him a legend. But at the end of the show, Ed Sullivan did something unprecedented. He brought Elvis back out and said to the camera, "Ladies and gentlemen, before Elvis leaves us tonight, I want to show you something that happened earlier this evening. Something important. Something that might just save your children's lives." The footage rolled. 60 million Americans watched Elvis take the polio vaccine. They heard him talk about Tommy Anderson. They saw that he trusted the science. And most importantly, they saw that nothing bad happened to him. What came next shocked everyone involved. The March of Dimes phones started ringing immediately. Not just dozens of calls. Not even hundreds. Thousands of parents calling to ask where their children could get the vaccine. By the next morning, vaccination clinics across America were overwhelmed with appointments. The requests were so numerous that clinics had to extend their hours and bring in additional medical staff. Within a week, the vaccination rate in America jumped from 30% to over. The March of Dimes campaign, which had been failing for months despite every effort, suddenly succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Dr. Jonas Salk himself sent Elvis a personal letter. "Your courage has done more to advance public health in a single evening than years of scientific explanation. You showed America that trust sometimes requires more than data. It requires someone they believe in showing them the way." But the impact went deeper than numbers and statistics. In living rooms across America, parents who had been paralyzed by fear of the vaccine found themselves rethinking their position. If Elvis Presley, the man they'd invited into their homes through their television screens, trusted this vaccine enough to take it publicly, maybe they could trust it too. If Elvis was willing to risk his career to show them it was safe, maybe it was worth listening. The polio epidemic that had terrorized American summers for decades began its decline. By 1957, cases dropped by 90%. By 1961, polio was virtually eliminated in the United States. Doctors and public health officials credited Elvis's television appearance as the turning point, the moment when the tide of public opinion finally shifted. Elvis himself rarely spoke about it publicly in the years that followed. When reporters asked him about the vaccination, he would deflect, saying he was just doing what anyone would do. But those close to him knew the truth. They knew about Tommy Anderson. They knew about the promise. They knew that Elvis had carried the weight of that little boy's death for 6 years. And that October night in 1956 was the night he finally fulfilled the obligation he'd taken on as a 15-year-old. Margaret Anderson continued her volunteer work with the March of Dimes for the rest of her life. She became one of their most effective advocates, traveling to communities across America to tell Tommy's story and to explain how Elvis had helped make sure other mothers wouldn't lose their children the way she had lost her. In 1977, just months before Elvis's death, Margaret wrote him one final letter. It was found in his bedroom at Graceland after he passed away, read and reread so many times that the paper had worn thin at the folds. "Dear Elvis, I'm writing to tell you something that I think you need to hear. Tommy died in 1950, but because of what you did in 1956, approximately 150,000 children lived, who otherwise would have been paralyzed or killed by polio. I've done the math. I've talked to the epidemiologists. That's their estimate. 150,000 children, 150,000 families, who never had to experience what I experienced. 150,000 mothers who got to watch their children grow up healthy and strong. You did that, Elvis. Not the doctors, not the scientists. You, because you were brave enough to keep a promise to a dying 7-year-old boy. I hope you know that Tommy would be so proud of you. I hope you know that every single one of those 150,000 children owes their health to your courage. And I hope you know that I will never ever be able to thank you enough for keeping your promise to my son." Elvis kept that letter in his nightstand drawer. Friends who saw him reading it said he would cry every time. Not tears of sadness, but something more complex. Relief, maybe, or vindication, or simply the weight of knowing that his promise had mattered. That Tommy Anderson's death had not been meaningless. That his own fame had been used for something bigger than entertainment. The story of Elvis and the polio vaccine became legendary in public health circles. It's taught in medical schools as an example of how to build public trust. It's cited in communications courses as a case study in effective health messaging. It's referenced in discussions about celebrity responsibility and the power of influence. But the real story, the story that 60 million Americans witnessed on October 20th, it's the story of a mother who turned her grief into purpose, who asked the impossible from someone she barely knew, and who lived to see her son's death contribute to saving countless other children.